we'll close with Rakesh again, and then Avantika will wrap up. So that's the speaking.
And do you want us to keep our screens on during the other panelists, or should we check out?
I think it always helps to keep the screens on. If it's okay, it just gives it a, I mean, in any case, virtual is so, it's not the same, but it's, so this, Rakesh is actually our 7th webinar.
Oh, I see.
On a pre-COP developments. We decided instead of doing side events at COP, which take up a lot of energy and you're one out of millions, we'd rather do pre-COP. So we've
much better.
One on extreme weather events, loss and damage. We've done on mitigation. We're doing on finance, a global stock take, and we are doing one on the voluntary carbon markets on Friday. Kishji, I'd love you to see our investigation. Avantika will send it to you on the voluntary carbon markets. It's a really, it's a proper investigation in terms of what's happening and how the markets are really not working for people or the planet and what needs to be done. So we'll definitely send that to you. Sebastian, I hope you got to see that. That would have been, and there's a French company involved with it. Some point we need a conversation on that.
So we're live now, and I think I'll get started with the conversation for today. So good evening, everyone. Good morning to those of you joining from other time zones. I'm Avantika Goswami, Program Manager for Climate Change at the Center for Science and Environment, New Delhi. We are delighted to co-host this event today with the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, or the GDP Center. This question of financial systems transformation or reforms to the international financial architecture has come into the spotlight over the past couple of years, and our purpose for hosting this discussion today was to assess whether 2023 has truly moved the needle on this vital conversation and what more needs to be done. With COP28 coming up, it was fitting to pick up from COP27's language in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. This called for a transformation of the financial system and its structures and processes, as well as a reform of multilateral development banks to be fit for the purpose of adequately addressing the global climate emergency. So in order to do this, 2023 saw a number of major fora that brought together two vital communities, development finance and the climate policy communities. From the World Bank and IMF meetings to the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact in Paris, to the G20 summit, these questions of deep systemic transformations that are needed to enable climate ambition and development in the global south were prominent everywhere. Questions about the debt crisis, the need to reform NDBs, the high cost of capital for green technologies have now come into the vocabulary and demands of civil society and leaders. And this has definitely been a great sign. But simply talking about these issues isn't enough. Meanwhile, climate impacts are piling up, global divisions are increasing. Today's panel will actually assess whether any progress has truly been made. And they will also share their vision for further concrete steps that should be precipitated at COP28 and beyond to create a fit-for-purpose financial system. With that backdrop in place, I'll introduce what my friend Rishikesh calls our all-star lineup today. So chairing today's session is a renowned economist as well as President Emeritus and Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, Dr. Rakesh Mohan. On the panel of experts, we have Indian environmentalist and CSE's Director General, Sunita Narayan. We have Dr. Kevin Gallagher, the Director of the Boston University GDP Center and a Professor of Global Development Policy at Boston University. We have Sebastian Trier, Executive Director of the respected Paris-based think tank, IDRI. And moderating today's discussion is Rishikesh Bhandari, a climate finance expert and Assistant Director of the Global Economic Governance Initiative at the GDP Center. So with that, I'll hand over to Rishikesh to start the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Avantika. It's really an honor to be co-hosting this with CSE. Today, the mission of the Centers to Advance Policy-Oriented Research to align global economic governance with development and climate ambitions. So we're very excited to be co-hosting this with all of you today. So since the panelists have already been introduced, let's dive right in. We will go to Dr. Rakesh Mohan for his opening remarks. I have the privilege of working with Dr. Mohan on the task force on climate change development in the IMF. And so it's great to see you here today as well. So if you could speak to what international financial institutions need to do to in support of climate change and development, but more specifically, if you could reflect on the political moment that we are in with various intersecting crises and a higher for longer rate environment that everybody is talking about. You have 10 minutes for your opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rishikesh. And thank you, Sunita, for inviting me to this, although I wasn't quite sure why I deserved this honor, because I'm not really a hardcore climate change guy like you, or person, I should say. But nonetheless, I have to admit that in the last few years, I have got much more interested in the issue and have been trying to learn more about it. So today I'm just going to talk about the international financial institutions and the need for climate finance, as I've been asked to do. So what is very clear in all the various estimates that are going around, the resource requirements for climate finance or finance related to climate change policies and actions are extremely high. And correspondingly, of course, there's a lot of discussion in the last few years on how to get those finances. And within that, of course, particularly in the last 1 year, as India chaired the G20, and the independent expert group was appointed under the chairmanship of Larry Summers and N.K. Singh, there was also the other group that had been appointed, that was the Committee on Independent Review of Multilateral Banks' Capital Adequacy Frameworks. So combined number of recommendations have come out. So there have been a good deal of activity in looking at what the MDBs and IMF can do. And of course, a number of recommendations have come out. So first, I would say that the numbers that are going around, you sort of go to all kinds of different sources, but they all go back to my friends Nick Stern and Amar Bhattacharya in terms of how much finance is needed. So it's very clear that the MDBs need to think, need to have a much larger role in this for the future, the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, than they've had in overall international financing. And the question is that with the kind of magnitude of financing needed, how much can they really do? So as of now, the total, I'm just looking at the World Bank, the total assets of the World Bank today are around little over around $250 billion, something like that. And that's the value of all the loans they've given so far, which are still outstanding. And then they have liquid assets about $80 billion. And obviously, therefore, by their statutes, their assets can't be more than their liabilities, which are essentially the callable capital, which is around 19 billion, and the callable capital, which is then about 280 billion or 300 billion or thereabouts. Plus, they have 31 billion retained earnings. And so the point is that so far, the model has been that the assets of the IBRD can't exceed their liabilities, that is to say the callable capital plus the retained earnings plus the callable plus the actual paid-in capital. So the first point to understand is that in fact, the paid-in capital of the World Bank is only around $20 billion. And that has leveraged something like $220+ billion, $250 billion, something of that order. So there's a actual leverage ratio of about 1 to 10. And so one of the recommendations, of course, from these various committees is to increase the capital of the World Bank. That is, paid-in capital, which will then, of course, have a corresponding amount of callable capital. The callable capital only comes into action when the assets go bad, they become non-performing assets. And quite frankly, if that ever happens, the World Bank shuts down, quite frankly. So they have to be very careful on this, actually. But what is, so that the various reports have suggested that the paid-in capital needs to be increased. But so far, the developed countries are not biting, which, if I can give my personal view, is bizarre in the sense that when there are geopolitical conflicts like in Ukraine and the Middle East right now, the amount of money that is put forward, is a multiple. So that, if all countries put together can say double the paid-in capital, say from 20 billion to 40 billion, you can unleash another 200 billion plus of lending capacity. But it is, to my mind, almost incredible that the world as a whole is dragging its feet on increasing the callable capital. I'm talking only the World Bank. You can then add the Asian Development Bank, the IADB, and others. So that's sort of the first point. Second, there is some discussion on whether the multilateral development banks should keep this 1-to-1 ratio between assets and liabilities. There are views which suggest that they can be less conservative without hurting their AAA ratings. Now, what is interesting there is that in the Intermediate Review of Capital Adequacy Frameworks, which submitted a report in July 2022, that they found three, it's amazing how much difference there is in different views. So they use the methodologies of the various credit rating agencies on what could the World Bank do to retain its AAA credit rating. And according to one methodology, they could increase their portfolio by only 34%. By another credit rating agency methodology, it said you could nearly triple its loan portfolio. And yet another credit rating agencies using their methodology, it can only increase about 11%. So this doesn't, this is despite expert group or high level, etc., talking to the credit rating agencies, and you don't get a clean answer. So my view in this remains what I just said at the beginning, that the easiest way to go is really to increase the paid-in capital. So I think there should be much more pressure to do that, because the leverage that they have is amazing. Second, the MDBs also enjoy preferred creditor status. That is, countries, is informal, of course, not binding, nor is contractual, that the borrowers, borrowing countries, if they get into any difficulty, they always have to first pay the MDBs and only then to the other creditors. So there can perhaps be some discussion on that and how the World Bank can increase its lending on the other MDBs while keeping the preferred creditor status. Third, there's also in the independent expert group has recommended the use of innovative instruments like hybrid capital, which is perpetual but without voting rights. I mean, quite frankly, again, if you don't have voting rights, and I mean, if you're not even willing to give capital with voting rights, why would you give capital without voting rights? And these are all, I'm sorry to use somewhat stronger language, these are all subterfuges to not do anything. And I think that this really needs to be pressed much more, which is the increasing of capital. Then there's the issue of catalyzing private investment by de-risking. Now, the managing director of the IMF, Georgieva Kristalina, and the head of their capital markets, MCM, Monetary and Capital Markets Department, Tobias Adrian, have estimated the private investors hold more than 200 trillion in assets, twice the global GDP, and therefore there's lots of private capital lying around which can be used. Now, I think that's correct. Obviously, there's a lot of capital there which can be utilized. But the key point is that the private sector will only invest if they get adequate returns. And therefore, many of the recommendations are to, one, improve the quality of the projects which the MDBs can help with so that they become creditworthy. Second, one other thing that can be done is that first, suppose the World Bank or any other MDB invests in a project, then once the project is completed, you can then sell that to private investors because then many of the risks have gone. So that I think is a very good idea, which has been used by countries themselves in different situations. Also to develop new instruments as equity and guarantees. Equity, I am doubtful whether the charters of the MDBs can permit equity, but certainly much more guarantee. The World Bank already has the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Association, MIGA is one of its arms. That can certainly be used much, much more.
Dr. Mohan, last 30 seconds.
Okay, well, I'll take a minute if you don't mind.
Okay.
So one general point I would make here is that one thing that is not mentioned in the IG report, as far as I can figure out, is what in India we call viability gap funding. That is to say that if you're not getting, say, the private sector requires 10% return, you get that the MDB puts in certain amount of money, and so that it becomes remunerative to the private investors, or also to think about interest rate subsidies, because if it is the case that market interest rates are too high for many of the renewable power projects, etc., then again, the MDBs could perhaps pitch in by giving interest rate subsidies, which of course is much smaller than the actual funding. Let me just conclude by talking about the IMF. The IMF, as of now, the voting, the distribution of quotas essentially reflects early to mid 2000s distribution of GDP in the world. They have a formula which has not changed since 2008 or so, but it's now 2023, so it's more than 15 years out of date. Now, what has happened is that in the 15th review of quotas, which was done, in 2020, nothing was done. In the 16th review, which has just been concluded, which the executive board has just concluded, they have proposed to the governing board increase of 50% of the quotas, but with no change in representation in terms of proportion of quotas. Now, what this means is that they've also said that by 2025, they've recommended a call for work to develop possible approaches as a guide of further quota realignment, including through a new quota formula. Now, that's very good. Hopefully something will be done by 2025. But the way the IMF quota works is that the new formula applies only to the incremental quota increase. So suppose the quota today is 100. In the 16th review, we're increasing it by 50 to become 150. So to have any significant effect of realigning the quotas, you'll have to say double that. So it's become even more difficult to realign. And that, in my view, will cause some issue of the credibility in the sense that emerging market and developing economies, particularly China and India, have increased their weight in the global economy. And if so, that's not represented in the governing structure of the IMF and similarly with the World Bank, that'll cause issues. So I will just conclude by saying that, look, a lot of, not action, but a lot of discussion has taken place in 2023 on getting more resources for the MDBs. Also new ideas so that they can be leveraged more. But it's, I would say, still far short of the kind of resources needed for climate change action. Sorry to be a couple of minutes over, but I thought that is worth doing from my point of view.
Great. No, thank you so much. And thank you for the discussion on the quotas, because I know that's an issue that you follow very, very closely and you're a big expert on. So let me go to Sunita next. And the question that we have for you is in terms of transforming the financial system, how important that is for climate justice. If you could discuss some of the specific needs of the hour, particularly pertaining to emerging markets and developing economies. Yeah, you have 10 minutes as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishikesh. Really grateful. And thank you, Rakesh ji, for such an important opening. So from my point of view, Rishikesh, and from our point of view at CSC, the issue of climate finance is critical to any action that we take. Let's understand why. There are two aspects to this. One is the fact that there are massive impacts because of climate change, extreme weather events, which are crippling countries today. Absolutely crippling countries. I mean, if you come to my part of the world, if you come to our part of the world, we can tell you, and we've just released a study, we can show you that we've had one extreme weather event a day in India, which means that you are seeing impacts on economies, on the development dividend that countries have invested in. I mean, the fact is, every flood, every drought takes away the infrastructure that governments build. And that's really the cost, the painful cost that our economies are paying today. So on one hand, we need the question of reparation, which is a tough issue. And I know it's a tough word to use in global conversations because it's like, don't talk about this. Let's just talk about some nice, genteel words. But it's time that we took the gloves off on many of these issues. We cannot anymore play beat around the bush. So the first issue is really about payment to countries for the cost that their economies are suffering because of the impacts of climate change. And the science is robust here. We know the attribution science. We know today that these are impacts which have been made worse, exacerbated because of climate change. Then there is the other real fact. And this is, on one hand, you can call this a moral argument and you can dismiss it and say, the world is not ready for your moral arguments right now. So let me give you the real facts. The real fact of the matter is that 70% of the world population does not have access to development or energy today. By 2030, the world will run out of the carbon budget that is needed to keep us below the 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. Now, the fact, therefore, is that 70% of the world population will need to grow. They will need to develop. India needs to develop its energy and double its energy consumption, its electricity consumption between now and 2030. That is the fact. And we don't have the atmospheric space, the carbon budget for us to do so. Now, go back to 1992, the deal was that we would develop, but we would develop differently because there would be money and technology provided for it. Today, climate finance is critical if you want that transformation in our part of the world to make sure that the world is secure, that the globe which is facing such an existential crisis can actually deal with it. So equity, climate justice is not a moral issue. It is an imperative for an ambitious deal, for a cooperative deal as we move ahead. Now, what we understand, and I will, Kevin, Rakeshji, Sebastian, you're bigger experts at this. But as we got into the issue of climate finance, and I would like to thank Avantika and her team for drawing some of these issues to my attention and for making me get more interested in this, is that we need to talk beyond what we call climate finance. OECD has published a very interesting report just yesterday or day before, which tells us that the world may just be close to the $100 billion climate goal when we reach COP. They're talking about 89.6 billion, so close to 90 billion annually, which was promised in 2015, may just be there. Now, just forget the question of methodology and what has been counted in this climate finance. What OECD also, their report shows, is that there is a decline in money for adaptation fund. That's very clear. But what it also shows is that the bulk of money is coming from multilateral and bilateral sources. So, Rakeshji, to your point, of the trillions of dollars in private sector, we are not seeing that in the case when it comes to climate finance. In fact, the OECD report puts down 83% of the nearly 90 billion, 83% has come from bilateral and multilateral sources, public sources. But then it also goes on to say that 55% of what is bilateral is given as loans and as equity. Okay? And if you take the total, then it's almost 80%. Now, just think about this, that in the name of climate finance, we are providing more money to countries for loan, which is going to countries which are already highly indebted, which are paying a substantial proportion of their annual of their country's revenue in debt servicing. And this when they are further hit by extreme weather events, which pulls them down a few notches. So we are creating a situation where the money that is going to supposedly help them to improve is only worsening their debt crisis. It's only making them more indebted, and they are being hit by climate extremes, which is even more crippling them. Now, this is the conversation that I think has reached a head. And I have to say, and thank you, Sebastian, thank you, Kevin, thank you, everyone. We have played a role to bring this conversation out. Till about 6 months, 9 months ago, we were only talking about chasing the 100 billion. I think today the needle has shifted. We are talking about the debt burden of countries. We are talking about what should be the nature of financing that comes to these countries. So from my point of view, I believe we have moved ahead. Avantika has done, and her team has done, a remarkable work, which I think will be available to you very soon, in putting down all the number of meetings that have happened this year. Now, when I read the outcomes of those meetings, sorry, Rakeshji, but those meetings just seem to me like a lot of the same people meeting together, saying the same things and going round in circles. We are not being able to come out with the scale and the pace of the change we need. But what I'm taking back is the fact that we have turned the conversation. And that is why, Rakeshji, your voice is needed. When we were only talking about climate change, we were only talking about climate change. Now we are talking about how do you reinvent the financial climate, the financial architecture for the future. I'm happy to see that the COP president has put that centrally, and he talks about the fact that we need a financial system for the future. I think that is important for us to begin the conversation. My hope is, Rishikesh, and I will end here, my hope is that at the COP28, that we are able to flag the question more centrally of the need of concessional grant funding to countries. The fact is the cost of capital is high, the cost of risk is high. It's made doubly higher because the cost of new renewable technology, the risk is even perceived to be higher. So what Africa gets in cost of capital of 20%, Europe gets at 2 to 3%. In that context, you can never get money for the energy transformation that is required. So I hope we have this conversation at COP28, and I hope in the final declaration, we get the need for concessional grant funding. And my final word is that the private sector, which clearly needs to come into this game, but the private sector will need to play with rules, by rules. And that, Rakeshi, is the toughest thing to ask for, because when we have just produced an investigation into the voluntary carbon market which operates, it is a market which is designed to make profits for the developers, for the registry, for the consultants, not for the planet or the people. So we need private capital, but with high integrity. Without that, I'm happy that they're not funding. At least we know that they're not part of the solution. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Sunita, for especially highlighting the shift, or rather the broadening out of the discussion from the 100 billion to the broader financial architecture reform in general. So with that, let me go over to Professor Kevin Gallagher next, and he will be talking about the range of reforms that are required at the Bretton Woods institutions to really support the achievement of the development and climate change goals. So Kevin, you also have 10 minutes.
Thanks, Rishi, and a great honor to be on this panel with my fellow panelists and to do this with CSE, where I've been a follower and a fan for I think 30 years at least. So it's great to be here, and I'll just jump where my last two friends just started off. I'm feeling good that our conversation has moved away from, billions of dollars of donations from the north to the south to tip off little projects here to a more mammoth but the more appropriate task, which is to green our financial and economic systems in a way that makes them low carbon, socially inclusive, and climate resilient. And if that is the goal, which we are now hearing everywhere, whether it be Prime Minister Motley in her Bridgetown initiative, or from grassroots groups and the presidents of African countries at the African Climate Summit, obviously the heart of that has to be reform, fundamental reform of the international financial institutions, which especially for emerging market and developing countries play a key role. Now, Professor Mohan, Dr. Mohan said that part of this is a massive resource mobilization endeavor. The independent high-level commission on climate finance, the Songway Stern folks, are saying that we're looking at upwards of $2.4 trillion a year that needs to be mobilized in between now and 2030. $1 trillion a year, which has to come from foreign exchange, foreign components. If that is done in the current interest rate environment, we will see a financial crisis like we have never seen in the world's history. And so the central goal of this resource mobilization has to be doing it in a manner where the cost of capital are lower than the growth rates of the economies moving forward in between now and 2030. While we say this, we have to remember that according to the new United Nations UNCTAD's Trade and Development Report, that right now as we speak, there are 3.3 billion people in the world. About half of the people in the world are currently living in a country that is spending more on external debt service than they are on health and education combined. There isn't commensurate climate finance needs around the world, but we calculated that there are good estimates for climate finance in Africa, and there's only 11 countries in Africa that could afford to meet their climate finance needs, and that's all that they financed. Not only is that environment concerning, but the cost of capital is going in the opposite direction of what we need. while we need to bend the cost of capital down to levels that are lower than our growth rates. Unfortunately, the multiple shocks, the war in Ukraine and the sanctions around it, the multiple climate shocks that Sunita mentioned, the interest rate shocks or interest rate hikes that have happened in the advanced economies, and now the war between Israel and Hamas are just the monthly shocks that happen to the world economy that spook the investment community to the safe assets of the U.S. dollar, depreciate developing countries' economies, raise the cost of capital, which squeeze their ability to move forward more and more every day. So we need a fundamental reform of the Bretton Woods institutions on 3 levels. Number one, they're not big enough. We heard a lot of this from Dr. Mohan. Number two, they're not good enough. Their policy frameworks are not fit for the purpose of what we need. And number three, they don't adequately represent the voice and representation of developing countries and the citizens in those countries. So these institutions need to be bigger, they need to be better, and they need to be more accountable to their clients. The good news is that reform is in the air, whether it is at the World Bank and some of the MDBs, or at the G20, or at the International Monetary Fund, or at all of these new things that are sprouting up on the calendar that aren't put there by the officials, such as the African Climate Summit, the French summit with Mia Mottley around Bridgetown and climate finance earlier this year. These issues are at the tip of everyone's tongue. This is the global policy agenda now. It's perhaps for the audience here and for my fellow panelists, the door is just ajar, but it's our job to kick it open and get as much as we can through that door in these urgent times where 3.3 billion people are taking a step backward every day that they move forward, and we're all jeopardizing our collective future at the same time. So in terms of making it bigger, let me just whip through a bunch of proposals that are out there that we need to be aware of and we need to organize around, and depending upon where you sit in the global agenda. So first, let's start with making the system bigger. And when I say we need to make the system bigger, there are 2 components of the system we need to make bigger. One is what we call the global financial safety net. If we are mobilizing this kind of finance and embarking in a global effort to change the structure of the world economies to make them low carbon, climate resilient, and socially inclusive, if we don't do that in a coordinated manner, it'll cost a lot of financial stability. And as we are mobilizing all this finance, as Sunita says, we're seeing shocks that hit everyone all the time, and our emergency response mechanisms are not robust. One of the things that has been landmark since the crisis has been a new issuance of special drawing rights. As the Bridgetown folks say, we need more of those, and we need, when they occur, some of them to be rechanneled for hybrid capital instruments, for things like the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, and for a number of different avenues so that poorer countries can reap more of the benefits. Right now, more of them get skewed to countries that don't need them. As Dr. Mohan said, quota increases at the IMF are on the table. Right now, they're incommensurate to the voice and representation that should be linked to those. I won't go deeper there because he's already said what the agenda needs to be on that space. One of the things that needs more attention is that the best component of the global financial safety net are currency swaps between largely by the Fed and the other C6 countries. They exclude developing countries from those. Instead, developing countries have to go to the International Monetary Fund, which impose fiscal consolidation and austerity as a condition for receiving those financing. And we have found that those kinds of programs actually exacerbate poverty and inequality and reduce the prospects for economic growth, whereas these Fed swaps are unconditional and help countries turn themselves around right away. In addition to expanding and making the global financial safety net bigger, we need bigger development finance institutions, and we need them to coordinate better. Dr. Mohan talked about the need for capital increases. I fully support that as the first and foremost thing, not only because it expands the capital, because if it's done right, it commensurately increases the voice and representation of developing countries at the same time. To complement that, these hybrid capital arrangements are important. We've proposed something called sustainable futures bonds, where development banks issue bonds just like they do, but central banks that have the headroom can purchase these bonds and convert them into equity, into perpetuity. That can expand the balance sheet of different development banks and also create a better reserve asset for countries that are looking to diversify their reserve asset portfolio. So this is good for development banking. It's also good for the reserve asset system. Countries also, these development banks need to not work in silos. I know Sebastian will talk about the Finance in Common Summit, which brings together national development banks from all around the world, whose total assets are over $20 trillion, whereas the MDBs are only $3 or $4 trillion. And if that whole system could work together and be like-minded, they could mobilize a lot more finance than the MDBs trying to get JP Morgan and other private sector actors to come in on a project and demand 20% return at a 7% interest rate, when the IDB has interesting projects where they work with national development banks in Chile and Uruguay that are like-minded, lend in local currencies, have lower interest rates, and can enable local capitalists and local currency markets in ways that are much more sustainable for developing countries. I'm running out of time here, so the last thing I'll say is that in addition to making these things bigger, they need to be better. The IMF and the institutions for global financial safety net have to have investment and stimulus-led recovery programs, just the way we do in advanced economies when we have a recession. And the World Bank and the other development finance institutions have to finance growth paths that are low carbon, socially responsible, and climate resilient, not just focus on how many new clean power plants am I going to create or how many coal plants might I close. Because if you do that in an environment where the policy frameworks are going in the opposite direction, even an investment in a solar project might not have a net positive impact. That's hard to hear for many climate activists, but we need growth paths, not whack-a-mole project finance, to be the center of the way we think about these reforms. I don't have time to talk about the reform of the common framework, which has largely collapsed over the past couple of days, given the fact that the bondholders would not take the same level of haircut that the development banks in China agreed to. That needs a fundamental reset in 2024. And to this conversation, even though every country in the G20 has ratified the Paris Agreement, the common framework and debt restructuring has been completely detached from those climate goals and our development goals. The level of debt reduction has only been to get countries to the suboptimal levels of resource mobilization that they were doing in 2019, not to the levels of resource mobilization that we need for a green and inclusive recovery. So thanks so much for having me be part of this conversation. I look forward to hearing Sebastian and having a global conversation with all the great folks who are on this call. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. Let me go to Sebastian next. And yeah, in terms of the prompt that we had for you, if you could focus on the reform of international financial institutions, and the realignment that is necessary to really make sure that they function in a manner that is fit for purpose, in a way, in the way that the panelists have already, been outlining. What reform measures do you think are the most vital? If you could reflect on that, you have 10 minutes as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for CSC and Global Development Policy Center for organizing this webinar and inviting me. I think a lot of the necessary reforms have been presented by Professor Mohan, by Kevin, by Sunita, and one of the key elements that I wanted to bring to the table is the question of the governance changes that are linked to recapitalization, and as something that is particularly blocking, I would say, a part of the conversation. And I will speak from a Paris-based. I'm not speaking for France, but I can give a little bit of understanding of what I hear in Europe about that issue. So my starting point is to some extent really Professor Mohan's statement that increasing capital is absolutely crucial, but how is that going to be possible? I want to mention that, so one thing that I can account for in the way that I saw the June summit in Paris on the new financial pact, that was a signal for me from a G7 country like France saying, yes, I've understood that the agenda is broader than the 100 billion. It's about the 1,000 billion. And it's about a bundle of issues that we cannot look at separately, from debt to IMF reform, MDBs, and the ecosystem. I mean, the MDBs as a system, the World Bank and MDBs as a system, etc., etc. I have never heard the idea that what was needed was a Marshall Plan for southern countries, but to some extent, so it was not said by European countries, but this was, I see something around the acknowledgement that this was something at the scale of that magnitude of a reform that was necessary. But France managed to just produce a pact for people and planet that was not endorsed by many countries because it was not negotiated. And I saw not numerous G7 countries signing up to it. So what I was, my first starting point is to say, I see not enough political energy from G7 countries jointly to really say, yes, we have an issue here. And in particular, I will come to Europe, but let me just start from there. One important thing that I heard, and that is still not acknowledged as such, when I was saying I didn't hear somebody saying we need a Marshall Plan. The image that comes to people is the amount of money that the US was able to pour on Europe. If you compare to the GDP of the United States after World War II, it was incredibly high. I can't remember the figure exactly, but it was incredibly high. And so I see that, at least in France, there is a recognition by the high-level authorities that we need to talk about recapitalization as a major issue. France is quite comfortable with that, given the fact that the current government has no issue in increasing ODA, rather is not in a position where the public opinion is asking, or the electoral results are asking for reduction of ODA numbers. There is an budgetary issue in France that postpones the objective of reaching the 0.7% of gross national income. So it's not completely positive, but compared to northern countries, Nordic countries, I would say, like Sweden, Finland, that have shifted drastically on that issue, or to the UK, France is in a better position to say, yes, let's face the issue of recapitalization. President Macron said officially at the end of August that he was really seeing the fact that we need to accept and embrace the fact that Europe's weight in terms of demographics and economic power is just decreasing, and that we need to accept, embrace that, and think ahead of what that would mean. And so he was really saying in that discourse, we should not shy away from the conversation on recapitalization. And we should not shy away that this discussion on recapitalization will open the discussion to other contributors, and thus to changes in governance in the IBRD and others. My understanding that is not documented is that this conversation is impossible in the US for the moment, not specifically because of the Biden administration, but because the link with Congress. So that conversation, that would mean a discussion on recapitalization linked to also governance issues, particularly is complicated because that would open more space for China in the governance of these institutions. So we need to look at the financial discussion as well as the political discussion, and those are linked. So I was really keen to see that there was a link made, so that the French president was officially saying we need to look at recapitalization from European countries and G7 countries. That will, if we open the door to that, it will also open the door to other contributors, and we need in the same movement to really accept the fact that this opens up a discussion on changing the voting rights in the governance of these Bretton Woods institutions. And I think what I see as needed is to prepare, particularly European players, about how they are going to negotiate politically internally the fact to contribute more and at the same time apparently lose influence in these institutions. I say apparently because I think we really need to prepare European players to think in terms of alliances with other countries in those institutions rather than in voting rights that would just have a budgetary financial way to look at these institutions. Of course, governance has been changing. There have been additional seats or announced for Sub-Saharan Africa, I think at the IMF, but also at the World Bank. So there are things changing. G20 also is including the African Union. So governance is not fixed, but not to the extent that needs to be prepared. I think that we need to prepare European players for. I think the critical, the IMF voting quota reform or discussion next year might be very important as a starting point. I just want to mention, because that could be also interesting in our conversation after my intervention that is going to be short, I hope at least, I saw a paper in the Financial Times that I had no capacity to really look into in terms of numbers. But most of the scenarios for changes in quotas at the IMF might open up for more seats for China, basically, and not for India and not for other emerging powers. So that's also, I think, one of the reasons why there is not a lot of, it's not just the northern countries that might be also trying to avoid these types of conversations, because it might be complicated to see what are the changes if we look at the scenarios exactly. So my main point is to say we need to have a conversation on increasing the capital of the banks, of the multilateral development banks. That is a complicated conversation for all G7 countries, but I think we need to prepare particularly the European countries, because the US is not going to be easily contributing to that, whatever the scenario in the elections in 2024. But I'm not sitting in the US, so Kevin might contradict me. And that needs also a conversation, a very larger conversation on how we can prepare and anticipate the changes in governance. Once I've said that, I nevertheless want to go a little bit more in details. I completely agree with the sequence of statements that need to be made. Kevin said what matters is really that we set our global economics and financial system in the right direction and not look just at financial, how did you put it? I mean, like donations from, or in the numbers of hundreds of billions from northern countries to southern countries. But I think we also need to nevertheless look in details about the fact that the IBRD needs massive amounts to be disbursed by IBRD. But if you look at IDA needs, we need also to be much more clear. I've been reading at a very important number in the second volume of the Independent Expert Group coordinated by Larry Summers and N.K. Singh, and they say we really need to look at IDA replenishment. The first volume was about we need to triple IDA replenishments. Amounts, but if what they say in the second volume is that this amounts to 0.04% of IDA country, IDA donors' gross national income. 0.04 is not nothing when you're in a trajectory of decreasing your contribution on ODA like some of the countries in Northern Europe. But 0.04 is not something that is, if you compare that to what has been spent on Ukraine, on military, on these issues, I think this is something that is really saying there are some orders of magnitude where we should not just shy away because of the magnitude of the challenge for the public budget, etc., etc. So, and I'm not saying that IDA is an easy, that the separation IDA-IBRD is very easy. I see, of course, that there are some countries, particularly the vulnerable middle-income countries, that are saying we need to have also a share of IDA because IBRD is not completely enough for us. So I'm not saying that I'm trying to say for most vulnerable country, IDA is enough and it's not a lot of money. And then for emerging powers, we have the IBRD and its massive amounts. It's of course much more complicated than that. I'm just trying to say this idea of a massive increase in capital, we need also to look into the details and also to look at how that how not just IBRD, but also other multilateral development banks. And of course, as Kevin said it, we need also to not just look at these multilateral systems, but how they can be linked to the national development banks and the public development banks. But my main point was to say, we are going to prepare as Europe-based think tanks with other colleagues to prepare the European governments to be fit for this conversation on recapitalization and changes in governance. It's not done yet, but we need to have that conversation.
Great. Thank you so much for that. So something that has really been shining through a number of your interventions is in terms of a capital increase. And so I wanted to pose the question and the set of challenges that Sebastian really articulated back to the panel to see if you had any reactions in terms of what are the roadblocks to actually making the size of these banks bigger, and what needs to happen alongside the recapitalization efforts. And so if members of the panel, and that includes you as well, of course, Dr. Malan, if you wanted to reflect on the recapitalization, and if you could just raise your hand, I'll come to you. So Kevin, you're first. I think you're on mute.
Well, I can tell you the way the major shareholder is thinking about it here in the U.S. We have a United States Congress that doesn't see the merit in these institutions for different reasons of the critical nature of that we've had here in this panel. So there's just a coalition that just does not see the merit of these, and in part the U.S. has created its own development bank called the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, which therefore pulls away. It's like, hey, we have our own now. We can do this rather than having to vote with India or anyone who wants us to do something else. So that's part of it, that there's just an increasingly sort of isolationist camp in our democracy here that doesn't see the merit of these institutions. Then, as Sebastian alluded to, there are some who see, of course, that the way the rules that the U.S. played a key role in writing are set up that capital increases are commensurate with increases in the voice and representation of the countries commensurate to their level of economic growth, as Dr. Mohan said, and that would give China more voice at the table. And some Americans are really concerned about that, and and so there's a coalition there that doesn't see it. Then there's another constituency, perhaps closer to the group that we're here, that says, when you look at it, these things don't have the demand that you'd expect. If we really refueled them, countries wouldn't borrow. That's often used as an excuse for not doing it, but there's some truth in it. But to me, that is because of it's not just the size, it's the delivery, is that we need to reform the institutions themselves so the products are better. As Ajay Banga said in Marrakesh, it takes on average 27 months for a project after approval to get going. And the development benefits take up to a decade. We don't have that kind of time. Many of those things that take time are things that we all hold dear to our health. We want to make sure that there's due diligence in the projects. We want to make sure there's been an environmental impact assessment. We want to make sure that there's grievance mechanisms so local communities can play a role and their voices can be heard. But 27 months is just off the charts for finance that needs to have happened yesterday. So that's the sort of the landscape of the bottlenecks that you hear in the country that I live in the political arena here on terms of the bottlenecks.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Would anybody else like to, Dr. Mohan?
Thank you very much, Rishi, and thank you, Sebastian, for your comments, giving us some idea of the discussions in Europe, and again, Kevin, the US. I was just looking at some numbers, so as I said, the total paid in capital of the World Bank is 20 billion. I think the assets, the amount of money that the Gates Foundation gives every year is something like 7 billion, if I'm not mistaken. I may have got it slightly wrong. The total amount of resources given by the US to Ukraine is around 80 billion plus. And Europe, including the UK, around 55 billion. So if we were to just increase double the capital, the paid-in capital of the World Bank, it would be 20 billion. And the US plus Europe would be only about 8 billion. Just compare that with about 130 billion plus 140 billion or something like that, given by the US and Europe to Ukraine. At the drop of a hat. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't give that money to the Ukraine. That's in some sense their view. But all I'm saying is from a think tank's point of view, right? In terms of making the case, right, that, look, this is worse than sufferings from a war, whether it's the Middle East or Ukraine or anywhere else for that matter, Sudan for that matter, right? That the suffering that will come by such finance not being available is much worse. And if you just double, and as I said, I think if my calculations are correct, the US plus Europe as a whole, the incremental contribution wouldn't be much more than 8 billion. Now, as far as the governance and quotas are concerned, I would say that suppose US and Europe said, actually, we'll contribute the whole of the 20 billion. Then I think that there would be justification for saying, look, yeah, we should also therefore have higher voice in the governance. I don't think anyone or many people wouldn't object to that. But presumably, if the US and Europe said we'll give so much money to increase the capital of the World Bank and other MDBs correspondingly, then presumably China will also cough up. Maybe Saudi Arabia will also cough up. Presumably India would also cough up. So I think that there needs to be much more voice in terms of really spelling out the benefits of doing something like this, not just for the world as a whole, but also the countries contributing. Because after all the money that is given to the World Bank, which then, of course, leverages 10 times. And that's how you get much more money from the private sector, basically the private sector who invests in World Bank and other MDB bonds. So you're really leveraging by giving 20 billion at world as a whole, in addition, you're really leveraging 200 billion in some sense from private money effectively. So that's a huge amount. And if I think that we as think tanks say that, look, what does this mean? When you give money to a country from outside, it doesn't get utilized unless they import exactly the same amount, right? Which means increase in demand for things that are produced in advanced manufacturing countries. Of course, that includes China. So, I mean, in some sense, we shouldn't be hurting ourselves at the world as a whole by saying, look, this will include China, so we can't do it. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I'll stop there, Rishikesh, because I can go on like this. But my simple point is that as think tanks and advocates of greater finance for climate issues, that I think that we really need to spell out much more how the increase in capital in terms of paid-in capital leverages so much money and what that money would be used for, and also say, look, this is how it will benefit the donors themselves, apart from benefiting the recipients.
Great. Thank you. Let me encourage the audience to write their questions into the chat. And as you do that, I'm going to ask a very quick question to the panel. I'm not sure if you saw the UNEP in its latest emissions gap report. It called the title was "Broken Record," and so I think the message is very clear that the emissions are they keep going up and we keep missing. Where the gap is still very, very big. So we've been talking about reforms at the IFI level. So I was wondering if we could do a very quick lightning round before we go to the audience Q&A in terms of the COP had a very clear call in Egypt last year that said the IFIs really have to move. What should the COP say to the IFIs this year? What would sort of be your one line statement in terms of how the COP should reflect back on the progress that's been made? We've discussed some of the specifics already, but if you could sort of touch on something that has not been a flag, that'd be great. Let me just run through the same order that we went to. So I'll go to Dr. Mohan first, and then I will go to Sunita, and then Kevin, and then Sebastian. So what should the COP say back to the IFIs from COP28?
Let me pass on this one, since I've never been that familiar with what happens in COP. So that's beyond my pay grade.
You're very lucky. You're very lucky. So I think, Rishikesh, for me, the message is urgency. The message is not enough is being done. There's a lot of talk, but not enough is being done. And I think what I would expect from the COP is to say that it is about concessional finance. It is about transformation. It's about getting money where it is needed the most. And that you need to figure out what you need to do, but you need to do it fast. I think this group of governments has to call out the urgency and the sheer need to be able to move much faster than we are on all these conversations. I mean, from what I can hear from Dr. Mohan and from Sebastian, from Kevin, it's an area I don't know that well. So what I can hear from you is that there are options. There's some easy wins that could happen, and we're not doing those either, okay? So then what are we talking about? And if you look at the scale of the funding for the war, and then you tell us in the developing world, in the countries of the South, that there isn't money for energy transformation and that this cannot be paid for, then, this is the hypocrisy that we are all calling out today in many other cases, but we are calling this out also in this. And it doesn't make for trust. It doesn't make for a world which will bring us together. In fact, Rishikesh, if I may just take a second to say that what I see happening, which can make for even worse conversation, is today the conversation on Paris-aligned finance, which is creating a condition. Dr. Mohan, you may not know about this, but essentially there is a talk now of there is now a part of the agreement that all finance has to be aligned with the Paris goals. Now that sounds good, it's very laudable, but the question is who decides what's a Paris goal? Will it be governments that will decide, or will we abdicate responsibilities further to agencies like multilateral banks who become bigger but not better? And I think that's the issue, Kevin, as well, that concerns all of us, that we are seeing in this global financial architecture, not only is it not working today for countries of the South when it comes to debt and it comes to funds, which are not grants, but it could be made even worse with conditionalities which come from the top, and very much like you said, don't fund this, we won't fund this fossil fuel project. And, what does a poor African country do? So I think we need to think more about these issues. Rishikesh?
Great, thank you. Kevin, and then Sebastian.
Well, since I'm on a Zoom call with some Indian friends, I'll quote what I think is the Indian quote of the world that over the past year and a half is that I think it was your foreign minister who said that the West thinks that its problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not its problems. That needs to be loud and clear coming out of the COP, where it's a UN-based forum where all countries, at least on paper, have equal voice. In these institutions that I've been talking about, they don't have equal voice. And the major shareholders really need to step up or step aside from blocking a lot of what's happening. The major shareholders have shown that they can mobilize billions of dollars in a second for a war in Ukraine or a war in the Middle East, but they're saying there isn't financing available for floods in Pakistan, floods in Durban, and hurricane restoration in Barbados. That just, it doesn't square. And not only is the health of the planet and the world's people in jeopardy here, the legitimacy of these institutions is really on the line. And this is something that Dr. Mohan talks about all the time, about the increasing multipolarity of the world. I think it's important to have increasing multipolarity, but that puts even a higher premium on multilateralism. And right now, whether we like it or not, the West holds the keys to multilateralism. So they need to step up and lead, not drag the system behind.
So, sorry, just to interrupt, Kevin, to add on a lighter note, what you just said about External Affairs Minister's statement that the West thinks that its problems are the world's. As you know, I've always been saying it was never a global financial crisis in 2008-9. It was the North Atlantic financial crisis. But when it happens there, you think it's the world's problem. They never called the Asian financial crisis of the 97-98 as a global financial crisis. But that's just on a lighter note, in a sense, responding to your remark.
Great, thank you. Sebastian, you're next.
Yes, thank you. There is not going to be a lot of debate because I will go along the same lines, namely that what I saw is that from Miamotley to the summit in Paris with Macron and with the Williams-Ruto Africa Climate Summit, at least you saw leadership from different regions. That was good. And I really, from my side, prefer that it's an agenda set by President Ruto than an agenda set by President Macron. What I'm lacking is the political championship of 2 to 3 countries per item, really saying that I'm going to find a political solution to something where the technical and macroeconomic solutions are there, but they are difficult to implement. And I think that's something that is extremely important. I don't see that leadership from G7 countries, and that's a problem. I don't see a joint leadership by G7 countries. And of course, the G20 countries by emerging powers, Indonesia, India, soon Brazil, and South Africa can do a lot of the job that can be done at G20. But this is not the same as saying on SDR rechanneling, how can we do that, ensure that the SDR rechanneling promises are held? This needs political momentum that we don't see. And I think that's really what's lacking to me. And so the COP should not, I mean, COP is just the same people. It's just the same parties. It's the same governments. Generally, it's the ministries for the environment, so they are not the one in charge of finance. But I think what's necessary is that what I would expect from COP is that it's a moment when we see some of these coalitions, champions, saying, I'm going to put my political energy in diplomatic terms to really solve one of the issues that are there on debt, on SDR channeling, on MDV's reform, etc. One element on which I want to come back to, Sunita said very clearly, there is a moral argument, but there is also a more instrumental or more pragmatic argument. And I think I'm not a macroeconomist who can demonstrate that, but I want to really, I'm telling the authorities in Europe that the financial instability of Zambia and Ghana is a macroeconomic problem for Europe. Probably not as direct as Greece was in 2008 because it was part of the European Union. But I think there is something that might not be exactly, I'm overstepping my capacity because probably a macroeconomist would say, You know, probably the Europeans won't care if there is a financial instability in Zambia and Ghana. And I don't want to scare them with issues of this would lead to catastrophes and migration, because this is not my point. Migrations are going to be intra-regional first, etc. It's really to say, if you don't bet on supporting Ghana and Zambia in debt distress, it's actually the financial instability of the world that is at stake. And that is to some extent linking to Professor Mohan saying what happened with the so-called Asian financial crisis. That was not a world crisis, in the words of the West.
Thank you. Dr. Mohan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just a comment on what Sebastian just said, supporting what he just said. Remember that when there's financial instability in an emerging market or a developing country, it's essentially to do with not being able to pay their debts to foreign creditors. Remember where the foreign creditors are. They're in Europe and the US, including the UK and Europe, perhaps Japan, now of course China as well. So the point is that when there is financial instability in an emerging market, developing economy, of course, depending on its volume, it is a problem for the donor countries. And quite frankly, that's where the IMF goes in to do their operations. I'm not criticizing that. I mean, I've been on the board of the IMF and I supported all those operations, because that's the reality, that after all, who lends and who gets into trouble? And so if the debtor is very large, then of course the creditor gets into real trouble. And that's what's happening in Europe in the debt crisis of the 2010s. If the debtor is small, well, in some sense it doesn't matter, except for the credibility of the system. So I think you're right, absolutely right, Sebastian, to point to that issue.
Great, thank you. I'm going to combine a bunch of questions that we have in the Q&A and come back to the panel with targeted questions. And so since loss and damage is a very big part of this COP, of course, there's a fair amount of interest in that. And I was wondering if I could ask you, Sunita, to reflect on where the loss and damage negotiations are. You know, we've heard a lot about the World Bank discussed today, but if you could respond to that. And to the rest of the panel, I was wondering if you could touch on private finance mobilization and the role that multilateral development banks are playing or are not playing. But if you could touch on that, then we will, unfortunately, we don't have too much time to do multiple rounds of Q&A, but we'll do this one very quickly. And then I'll pass it over to Dr. Mohan for his closing remarks. So if I can start with Sunita on loss and damage, then I'll go to Kevin and Sebastian on MDBs and private finance, then finally Dr. Mohan.
So Rishikesh, I think we're at a very tough time in the world. And but I believe that the current agreement on loss and damage is as good as what we can do. Now, I hate being pragmatic, and I'm the last person to be accused of saying that, you know, this is the best you can get. But at this time, when you have such a loss of faith and you have such deep distrust, I think it is important for us to build upon the bricks that we have on the current agreement. Now, it's not the best, but as most of us have read and have heard about the role of the US in the last few hours of the Loss and Damage Fund, that tells us the kind of pressure that could still come in Dubai. I mean, if we turn this loss and damage into nothing more than voluntary contributions, as much as we can do, then we are back to, I'm sorry, Sebastian, but we are back to the Paris Agreement formula of do what you can. And we are now realizing that we are over 2 degrees centigrade rise, 3 degrees centigrade rise. We need a rule-based system. And this is the beginning of a rule-based system that we have in a loss and damage fund. So as I see it, no going back right now. The role of the World Bank still seen as transitional. I'm not sure what that will mean, but it's a step ahead. I'm not going to kick it down the road right now. I'm going to say this is a step ahead. We need to build upon it, but we need to realize that this loss and damage fund will have to play a big role in the kind of crises that the world is beginning to see today, and do it fast. And Sebastian, I also hear that the EU has agreed for a substantial amount to come in. I think that's good news. And that definitely is something that we in our world, which is struggling to find a glimmer of hope, we need to clutch on to.
Great, thank you. Let me go to Kevin next on the role of MDBs in mobilizing private finance. What are the challenges? What can be done?
Yeah, well, the first challenge is that MDBs are being asked to do much. They can't do too much. They can't regulate the global economy. That's not their job. And so the most important thing for aligning our financial and economic systems with our development and climate goals has to happen at the centers of the global economy, in New York, in the United Kingdom, and in Shanghai, and coordinated through multilateral bodies like the G20 and the United Nations and beyond. Right, that's where the heart of the system is, and the MDBs can play a role there. Now, in terms of their own project, as we know from the the Global Financial Stability Report of October 2022, the MDBs are not doing a great job in crowding in private finance for a variety of different reasons. And it's important, right? Public finance needs to increase by orders of magnitude, but it's no substitute for greening the whole system and bringing in the private sector. I think there's been too much emphasis in trying to bring in big Western financial entities who are in foreign currencies and demand 18 to 20% return, whether it be in a PPP project or after a development bank has de-risked the sovereign so much that a international financial house might feel safer to go in. We've seen that de-risking has played a role in some of this debt crisis and so forth for many of these countries. I think we need a shift on the MDBs in twofold. Number one is that they really should focus on blending finance from the ground up, that they can collaborate with national development banks that don't demand a 20% return, that work with local capitalists, that work in local domestic capital markets and can issue things in domestic currencies and build out the development aspects from the ground up. That capital is much more patient. It's not going to pick up and go away when there's a climate shock or when there's a interest rate shock. So that's important. And then the other thing, which is a real gap in the MDBs, is that we should be focusing more on positive spillovers than on crowding in private finance. What do I mean by that? Is that when you build a road or build a high-speed rail or build a renewable energy network or a new grid, it has opportunities to open up new possibilities in the economy, right? If you link rural women to domestic markets in a city, that opens up all sorts of things along the way, that other different kinds of economic activity on the domestic level that essentially does crowd in private finance, but in a different way. It's more like a multiplier effect as we talk about it in macroeconomics. We don't talk about the multiplier effects of the investment as much as we talk about how to get more and more foreign investors involved in the project to begin with. So one, keep at it with the foreign investors. They have to have a regulatory environment where they don't demand 20% return in foreign currencies. They need a global and more incentives to play a role in steering the financial system towards public ends. But we also need to build from the ground up and get local currencies and local countries involved. And finally, let's focus on spillovers to make sure that every dollar multiplies more kinds of economic activity after the projects are done.
Great, thank you. Sebastian.
Thanks a lot, and I completely agree with Kevin, who says it in terms that are much more accurate than mine. Maybe one thing that I think is very important is that depending on what you want to what you're talking about, so it's always the experts saying it's more complex, but I'm trying to say, depending if you fund an infrastructure, if you fund agricultural development or productive investments, or it might be very different where we need to have public money to ensure that there is enough domestic capital invested in a productive investment and some foreign capital invested. And so that's, I mean, de-risking seems like we want to publicize risk and privatize profits. That's always a risk somewhere, but sometimes it's exactly what we need to do. So I think I would just probably say de-risking is not the only buzzword. There are depending on what you are talking about, it might be very different ways that we need to look at how to ensure that there is the right type of private investment in what we are talking about. And one element that I just quote from a report by ODI, Annalisa Plizzon, on the operating model of the MDBs is that one thing that is extremely important that the beneficiary countries are saying, there is a very, very good thing in the MDBs, it's their technical assistance, but it's not designed in a longer term perspective. So we don't have some type of capacity building through this technical assistance that is not just project based, but that would be building capacities. And we see that at IDRI in the fact that we really need to have, for instance, one key element that Kevin was mentioning is the idea to have a growth path that is really saying what is the investment plan for growth in a country. And in that case, it's not just project by project, but it's a type of project with the vision of the transformation that is there. For a country to build that, you need technical assistance that is really embedded in how my colleague from Nigeria, Chukso Kereke, is saying it, indigenous expertise, and not the BCGs and McKinseys of the world, but indigenous expertise that are there to really build that plan and the solidity of that growth path. And that's something that, for instance, is very important because then you can aggregate local domestic capital market and international investments.
Great, thank you. Now we only have a few minutes left, so if Dr. Mohan, if you could do a very quick closing statement, and then Avantika will wrap us up.
Thank you very much. I'll be very quick. I won't try to summarize because I think Kevin did a very good job along with Sebastian. Just a couple of 2-3 points. One, that as I said before, that I don't have direct knowledge in some sense of COP28, how it works. But I think that in general, whether it's COP28 or otherwise, we need to now move away from these trillions of dollars numbers. Because to my mind, what they do is, see, I have no concept what $1 trillion means. Okay. I am not beginning to have some sense what $1 million mean, almost. So what I'm saying is that I think that we now know what is needed till 2050, till 2070, and so on. I think that what we now need to do is to break down in actual projects and programs what needs to be done over the next 7 years in actual projects, in actual countries, or actual programs in actual countries, and then tot up how much finance is required. And presumably they'll break them down what is required. And then, of course, finance and technology to say, look, this is what is needed. Because I think that'll start making more practical sense. Because we've got all these trillions of numbers now. Okay, 1. 2, in the same vein, identifying cross-border programs and projects, because that's an issue that has not been addressed very much, as it ought to be for these global public goods. Again, since we all talked about the increase of capital for the MDBs, I'm not picking on the Gates Foundation because we also are beneficiaries of them at CSEP, but just because they're much more transparent than many other foundations, they actually have paid in as capital of $70 billion, 3.5 times the World Bank. Okay, one of the things I think that Rajat Banga also mentioned in one of his informal talks was an equivalent of what we have in India, the corporate social responsibility, CSR contributions. So looking at these kind of numbers, whether we can generate by some sort of international agreement that if multinational corporations, including those in India, everywhere else, contribute, I don't know, some percentage like 0.5, 0.2% or something, whatever the numbers come to, of their profits to increasing the capital of these MDBs, because that will then go into the multiplication in terms of leveraging. So just this thought, it always needs much more work. Let's think of the governance of those donations and of the institutions. But if the congresses of the world don't agree, then I think that's another. I think is a practical approach. Final, that again in terms of international transfers to countries, except for grants, okay, debt and equity have to be serviced. And Sunita made this point that debt and equity have to be serviced. So you make the countries more indebted, or of course service the equity. And so there's a limit to that. And that also needs to be worked out much more carefully. I'll stop there. And Avantika, all yours. Oh, Rishikesh.
Yeah, no, Avantika, yeah, all yours.
Very good point.
So I think today we've heard an entire menu of recommendations, solutions, next steps outlined by our very diverse set of panelists. I'd encourage everyone to rewatch the recording, because there's been so much that was put out in terms of possible solutions, from low-hanging fruit like more parent capital for MDBs to the need for more grant-based concessional finance, bigger development finance institutions, and some excellent quotes as well. We need a new Marshall Plan for Global South countries, how the major shareholders of IFIs need to step up or step aside. So these are very clear and concrete ways forward. So I'd like to thank Rishikesh for moderating the session. Thank you to Dr. Mohan for chairing the session so expertly, and it absolutely did not come across that you're not familiar with the COP system. We benefited so much from your insights. Thank you to our excellent panelists for sharing their respective visions for the way ahead. COP28 starts next week, and there will be no escaping the question of finance. These systemic reforms that have been discussed today will be imperative for the success of many discussions on climate ambition that will be held in Dubai. CSE and the GDP Center will both be at COP28, and we definitely hope to connect with those of you watching today who will also be present in Dubai. So thank you for tuning in, and that's it from our end for today. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.